Jake Mercer lay broken and dying in a canyon no one would search, his body shutting down with every breath. Then a white stallion appeared and did something wild horses should never do. He called for the rescuers himself. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Mercer had always believed that a man's fate was written in the choices he made, not in the stars above or the prayers whispered in darkened churches. At 31 years old, he had built a reputation across 3 territories as the best horsebreaker anyone had ever seen, a man who could gentle the wildest Mustang with nothing more than patience, respect, and an understanding of what it meant to be free. His hands bore the scars of his trade, rope burns and bite marks, crushed fingers that had healed crooked. But they were gentle hands despite their roughness, capable of coaxing trust from creatures that had known nothing but fear and the open range. The irony was not lost on him as he lay broken at the bottom of Copper Canyon, his body refusing to respond to his mind's desperate commands, that the very gift which had made his name might die with him in this godforsaken ravine where no one would think to look. The morning had started like any other in late September, the Arizona sun still carrying summer's heat, but with an edge that promised autumn was coming. To claim the high desert, Jake had ridden out from the Double R Ranch before dawn, his bay gelding stepping sure-footed through the sagebrush while the stars still burned overhead. Old Man Richardson had hired him to track down a band of wild horses that had been raiding the ranch's water sources, and among them was a stallion that had become something of a legend in these parts. They called him Ghost, a pure white Mustang that moved through the canyon lands like smoke, impossible to catch, impossible to forget once you'd seen him. Some of the ranch hands claimed he wasn't real at all, just a trick of the desert light playing games with men who spent too long under the sun. But Jake had seen the tracks, had spotted the distinctive markings where the stallion's right front hoof bore a crescent-shaped chip, and he knew Ghost was as real as the dust beneath his boots. The plan had been simple: track the band to their grazing grounds, assess the stallion's temperament and the herd's patterns, then report back to Richardson with recommendations. Jake had never been interested in breaking a horse that didn't want to be caught, and he certainly wasn't going to chase down a wild stallion for the sake of some rancher's pride. But Richardson was paying good money just for the reconnaissance, and Jake needed the work. The last few years had been hard on independent horsebreakers, with more ranchers turning to cheaper methods and younger men willing to risk injury for lower wages. At 31, Jake was beginning to feel old in a profession where most men either retired by 30 or ended up crippled, their bodies broken by the very animals they sought to tame. He had tracked Ghost's band into the network of canyons that webbed through this part of the territory like veins in a leaf, narrow passages where the sandstone walls rose 300 feet on either side, and the shadows stayed cool even at midday. It was dangerous country for a man alone, places where a single misstep could send you tumbling down slopes of loose shale, where flash floods could appear with no warning, turning dry washes into raging torrents in minutes. But Jake knew these canyons, had spent the better part of 5 years exploring their secrets, mapping their hidden springs and sheltered grazing areas in his mind. He respected the land's dangers, but he didn't fear them, and that confidence had served him well until the moment it betrayed him completely. The accident happened so fast that even afterward, lying broken and barely conscious, Jake couldn't quite piece together the exact sequence of events. He had dismounted to examine fresh tracks where the canyon floor narrowed to barely 15 feet across, the walls pressing close enough that he could touch both sides if he stretched out his arms. His gelding had been standing patient as always, reins dropped in the way of a well-trained cow horse that would ground tie till kingdom come. Then something spooked him, a sound or a scent that Jake never identified, and the gelding bolted backward with a violence that spoke of genuine terror. The movement startled Jake, made him turn quickly on the loose rock, and his boot caught on a buried root or stone. He never knew which. He went down hard, his head striking the canyon wall with a sound like a gunshot, And then he was sliding, tumbling down a slope he hadn't even realized was there, his body collecting new injuries with each impact against the unforgiving stone. When he finally stopped moving, wedged against a boulder at the bottom of a 20-foot drop, Jake's first coherent thought was that he was going to die here. The realization came with a strange clarity, without panic or fear, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. He couldn't feel his legs, couldn't move anything below his waist, and the warm wetness spreading beneath him suggested injuries he couldn't afford to examine too closely. His head throbbed with a pain so intense it made his vision swim with dark spots, and when he tried to call out, his voice emerged as nothing more than a whisper that the canyon walls swallowed without echo. Above him, impossibly far away, he could see the strip of blue sky that marked the canyon's rim, and he understood with perfect certainty that no one would find him here. The Double R Ranch wouldn't start looking for him until he failed to return by nightfall, and even then, they would search the main trails first, the obvious places where a man might run into trouble. This nameless side canyon, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through, would be the last place anyone thought to look. Time became strange after that, measured only by the movement of shadows across the canyon walls and the waves of pain that crashed over him with increasing frequency. He tried to stay conscious, knowing that sleep might be the final surrender, but his body had other ideas. Several times he surfaced from darkness to find the light had changed, hours passing in what felt like moments, and each time it was harder to claw his way back to awareness. His thoughts drifted to his sister back in Tucson, to the niece and nephew he hadn't seen in 2 years because he was always chasing the next job, the next horse, the next horizon. He thought about all the things he would never do now, the ranch he'd planned to buy someday, the family he'd always assumed would come later when he'd saved enough money and settled down. Later had seemed so certain, so guaranteed, and now it was evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. It was during one of these periods of semi-consciousness, when the shadows had grown long and the canyon had filled with the golden light of late afternoon, that Jake heard the sound of hooves on stone. At first, he thought it was his gelding returning, drawn back by the bond between horse and rider that sometimes transcended fear and instinct. But the footsteps were wrong, too light, too deliberate, moving with a caution that spoke of wild things approaching something unknown and potentially dangerous. Jake tried to lift his head, managed to turn it just enough to see the source of the sound, and felt his breath catch in his chest, despite the pain the movement caused. The white stallion stood at the edge of the slope Jake had tumbled down, his coat catching the afternoon light like fresh snow, his dark eyes fixed on the broken man below Ghost. Jake thought through the fog of pain and fading consciousness, though he couldn't say whether he spoke the name aloud or merely thought it. The stallion's presence seemed impossible, mythical, like something from a fever dream or the stories told around campfires to entertain greenhorns fresh off the train from back east. But there he was, solid and real, his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for the scent of blood and injury, his ears swiveling forward with an intelligence that Jake had seen in the finest horses he'd ever worked with, and some that had been beyond even his considerable skill. For a long moment they regarded each other across the space that separated them, man and beast, broken and free, dying and vital. Jake wanted to speak, to call out to the creature that represented everything he loved about this hard country and the animals that survived in it, but his voice had abandoned him entirely. Now instead, he simply watched as Ghost took a tentative step down the slope, then another, his movements careful but purposeful, as if he had made some decision that defied all logic and natural instinct. The stallion's presence should have been threatening, a wild animal approaching injured prey, but Jake felt no fear, only a strange sense of peace, as if the universe had sent him a witness to his final moments, a reminder that beauty and wildness would continue long after he was gone. The last thing Jake remembered before consciousness fled entirely was the stallion's warm breath on his face, the gentle touch of a muzzle against his cheek, and the thought that maybe fate wasn't written in choices after all, but in the unexpected moments when the wild places of the world revealed their secrets to those about to leave them forever. When Jake surfaced again, the canyon had filled with the purple shadows of evening, and the temperature had dropped enough that he could see his breath in the dimming light. The pain had become something almost separate from him now, a constant companion that no longer demanded his full attention, but simply existed as the background noise of his failing body. He knew this was a bad sign. This distance from his own suffering, recognized it as the body's way of preparing for the end. He had seen it before in injured horses, the way they would grow calm and still in their final hours, as if accepting what was coming with a grace that humans rarely managed. But what drew his attention now, what pulled him back from the edge of that final darkness, was the realization that he was not alone. Ghost stood 20 feet away, positioned at the mouth of the narrow defile where Jake had fallen, his white coat ghostly in the failing light. The stallion's posture was alert, but not alarmed, his head high and ears pricked forward, listening to something Jake's damaged hearing couldn't detect. For a moment, Jake wondered if he was hallucinating, if the blow to his head had conjured this magnificent creature from the depths of his dying brain as some kind of final gift. But then the stallion shifted his weight, and Jake heard the distinct click of hoof on stone, real and solid and undeniably present. The question that filled Jake's fading mind was simple and profound at once. Why? Why would a wild Mustang, a creature whose survival depended on avoiding humans and their traps and their ropes, why would such an animal stay near a man who could offer nothing but the promise of danger? The answer came slowly, pieced together through the fog of pain and approaching delirium, remembered from years of working with horses and learning their language. Ghost wasn't staying because he felt compelled to help. Horses didn't think in those terms, didn't conceive of rescue or obligation the way humans did. He was staying because something about this situation had triggered a response deeper than learned caution, something primal that predated domestication, and the fear that men had bred into his kind over centuries of breaking and binding. Jake had seen it before in mares protecting foals that weren't their own, in geldings that would stand guard over injured herd mates rather than flee to safety. It was the herd instinct, the ancient knowledge that survival sometimes meant standing together against the threats that the wilderness presented. But Ghost was a stallion, solitary by nature except for his band of mares, and Jake was no member of his herd. The fact that the white Mustang had chosen to remain was something else entirely, something that Jake's rational mind struggled to categorize even as his deeper instincts understood it perfectly. This was recognition between kindred spirits, an acknowledgement that transcended species, the wild recognizing something equally untamed in the man who lay broken at the bottom of the canyon. Jake had spent his life refusing to truly break the horses he trained, preferring instead to find the place where their wildness and his purpose could coexist, where partnership replaced domination. Perhaps Ghost sensed that difference, that respect, in a way that went beyond words or conscious understanding. As the stars began to emerge in the narrow strip of sky visible above the canyon walls, Jake felt his awareness starting to slip again. The cold was settling into his bones now, making his already labored breathing even more difficult, and he knew that if he lost consciousness again, he might not wake up. The night temperatures in these canyons could drop 40 degrees from the daytime highs, and in his injured state, hypothermia would claim him long before thirst or blood loss finished the job. He tried to move, to shift his position enough to generate some warmth, but his body refused to obey. Only his right hand responded, fingers twitching weakly against the sandy floor of the canyon, and even that small movement sent fresh waves of agony radiating through his chest where he suspected broken ribs had punctured something vital. Ghost noticed the movement immediately, his attention snapping back to the fallen man with an intensity that was almost unnerving. The stallion took several steps closer, close enough now that Jake could see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes, could make out the scars that marked the animal's coat, evidence of battles fought for dominance. of encounters with mountain lions and rattlesnakes, of a life lived on the edge of survival, where every day demanded strength and cunning. This was no tame horse gone feral, no domestic animal reverting to ancestral patterns. This was wildness in its purest form, and the fact that such a creature had chosen to remain near him filled Jake with an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and wonder, and a profound sense of connection. The stallion whinnied suddenly, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to carry for impossible distances in the still evening air. Jake's foggy mind struggled to understand the purpose of the call. Was Ghost summoning his band, preparing to leave now that darkness had fully fallen? But the mares didn't appear, and after a moment, Ghost whinnied again, louder this time, more insistent, and Jake realized with a jolt that cut through even his pain-dulled awareness what the stallion was doing. He was calling for help, not for his herd, but for Jake's, for the humans who might be searching, might be within earshot, might still have time to find their fallen companion before the desert cold claimed him forever. The understanding brought tears to Jake's eyes, hot against his cold cheeks, and he tried to call out himself, to add his voice to Ghost's, but managed only a weak croak that barely carried past his own lips. It didn't matter. The stallion continued his calling, moving back and forth at the mouth of the narrow canyon like a sentinel, like a guide marking the location of something precious that others needed to find. Jake watched through increasingly blurred vision as Ghost repeated the pattern, calling out, waiting, calling again, and he found himself thinking about all the stories he'd heard over the years, tales of horses that had saved their riders, of animals that had shown intelligence and loyalty that defied explanation. He had always appreciated those stories, but had never quite believed them, had chalked them up to coincidence and the human tendency to ascribe meaning to random events. But there was nothing random about what Ghost was doing. The stallion could have left hours ago, could have returned to his band and the safety of numbers, could have put miles between himself and the scent of human blood and injury. Instead, he remained, and his calls grew more urgent as the temperature continued to drop and Jake's shivers became uncontrollable spasms that jarred his broken body and threatened to push him over the edge into shock. The pain was becoming unbearable again, breaking through the numbness that had protected him, and Jake heard himself making sounds he didn't recognize, animal noises of suffering that should have sent any wild creature fleeing in the opposite direction. Ghost didn't flee. He moved closer instead, until he stood directly over Jake's prostrate form, his bulk blocking the wind that had begun to funnel through the canyon, his body heat radiating down onto the injured man like a benediction. Jake tried to reach up to touch the magnificent creature that had become his unlikely guardian, but his arm wouldn't cooperate. Instead, he lay there, looking up at the white stallion silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and felt something shift in his understanding of the world and his place in it. He had spent his life working with horses, believing he understood them, that his gift for gentling wild things gave him insight into their nature. But Ghost was teaching him something new in these final hours, showing him that the bond between human and horse went deeper than training or domestication, deeper than the thousands of years of partnership that history recorded. It was something fundamental, written into the very fabric of creation, a recognition that some souls were meant to understand each other, regardless of the forms they inhabited. The stallion whinnied again, and this time, impossibly, Jake heard an answering call in the distance, human voices shouting, the sound of multiple horses moving through the narrow canyons with the controlled urgency of a search party. Hope flared in his chest, painful and overwhelming, and he tried to respond, to guide them to his location, but his voice was gone entirely. Now Ghost heard them, though, and he moved away from Jake's side to the canyon entrance, calling again and again, his white coat making him visible even in the darkness, a beacon that no searching eye could miss. The voices grew closer, and Jake could distinguish individual speakers now, men from the Double R Ranch calling his name with increasing desperation. He recognized Charlie Brennan's gravelly baritone, roughened by years of tobacco and whiskey, and the younger voice of Tommy Rodriguez, the kid who'd attached himself to Jake like a shadow whenever he visited the ranch, peppering him with questions about horse training and asking to help with the breaking work. They were close now, maybe only a few hundred yards away, but the maze of interconnecting canyons could keep them searching for hours if they took wrong turns at any of the dozen forks and branches that split off from the main passages. Ghost seemed to understand this instinctively, positioning himself where the light from their lanterns would catch his white coat, calling out at regular intervals like a foghorn guiding ships through dangerous waters. Jake heard the exact moment when they spotted the stallion. Tommy's voice rose in excitement, calling out to the others that he'd seen something, a white horse standing at the mouth of a side canyon they hadn't explored yet. Charlie's response was immediate and cautionary, warning the younger man not to spook the animal, that wild mustangs were unpredictable and dangerous if cornered, but Ghost didn't act cornered or threatened. As the search party approached, the stallion held his ground, continuing his insistent calling, and Jake could hear the confusion in the men's voices as they tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Wild horses didn't behave this way, didn't stand their ground when humans approached with lanterns and ropes and the smell of civilization clinging to their clothes and gear. From his position at the bottom of the narrow defile, Jake couldn't see the interaction that followed, but he could piece it together from the fragments of conversation that drifted down to him. Charlie was arguing that they needed to focus on finding Jake, not waste time with some Mustang that probably had nothing to do with their missing friend. But Tommy, who possessed the kind of intuition about animals that couldn't be taught, only recognized, was insisting that something was different about this horse, that his behavior suggested purpose rather than random chance. The debate might have continued indefinitely if Ghost hadn't made the decision for them, turning away from the searchers and walking deliberately into the narrow canyon where Jake lay dying, looking back over his shoulder as if checking to ensure they were following. The first face Jake saw when the lantern light spilled into his small prison was Tommy's, the young man's features contorting with shock and horror as he took in the extent of Jake's injuries. Behind him, Charlie swore with the creative fluency of a man who'd spent 40 years working cattle and horses, and within seconds, the narrow space was filled with activity. Hands were touching him, gentle but urgent, assessing damage and trying to determine how to move him without making his injuries worse. Someone draped a blanket over him, and the warmth was so intense after hours of cold that Jake gasped, the sound emerging as more of a sob. Charlie's weathered face appeared above him, concern etched deep in the lines around his eyes, and the older man spoke with a gentleness that Jake had never heard from him before, telling him to hang on, that they were going to get him out, that help was coming. But even as they worked, Jake's eyes searched the darkness beyond the circle of lantern light, looking for the white stallion that had saved his life. Ghost stood at the edge of the glow, visible only as a pale shape in the shadows, close enough to observe, but far enough to maintain the distance that his wild nature demanded. Their eyes met across the space, and Jake felt a connection so profound it transcended the physical pain that consumed him. This magnificent creature had chosen to stay when every instinct should have driven him away, had called for help when no one would have blamed him for disappearing into the night, had stood guard over a dying man for reasons that Jake was only beginning to understand. It was a debt that could never be repaid, a gift that defied the natural order as humans understood it. The process of getting Jake out of the canyon was excruciating beyond anything he'd experienced before. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from blankets and saplings, working with the careful efficiency of men who understood that every moment counted, that infection and shock were racing against them, even as they prepared to move him. When they finally lifted him, Jake's world exploded into white-hot agony that drove the breath from his lungs and sent his consciousness spiraling toward darkness. He fought to stay aware, clinging to the sound of the men's voices, the rhythm of their boots on stone, the creaking of leather, and the snorting of horses as they navigated the treacherous path out of the canyon system. Through it all, he was aware of Ghost pacing alongside the rescue party, maintaining a distance of about 20 feet but never losing sight of the injured man he'd chosen to protect Charlie. Noticed the stallion's behavior and commented on it to Tommy, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. In all his years working with horses, he'd never seen anything like this. A wild Mustang acting like a trained herding dog, staying with a group of humans against every natural instinct. Tommy's response was quieter, more thoughtful, suggesting that maybe Ghost recognized something in Jake that the rest of them couldn't see, that the bond between a true horseman and the animals he worked with went deeper than training or breaking or any of the words they used to describe the relationship. The kid was more right than he knew, Jake thought through the haze of pain. But the understanding was beyond words, beyond explanation, existing in that space where respect and wildness and mutual recognition created something that neither species could achieve alone. They reached the main canyon after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes of careful navigation. A wagon waited there, borrowed from a nearby ranch and outfitted with straw and blankets to cushion the journey back to town. Dr. Sarah Chen was already there, having ridden out from Silver Creek the moment word reached her that one of the territory's best horsebreakers was missing. She was a recent arrival from San Francisco, a Chinese woman who'd trained at a real medical school back east and who faced constant skepticism from the ranchers and miners who made up most of her patient base. But she was good, maybe the best doctor the territory had seen in decades, and Jake felt a surge of relief when he saw her efficient movements as she examined his injuries by lantern light. Her face was grave as she worked, and Jake saw her exchange a significant look with Charlie that spoke volumes about the severity of his condition: multiple broken ribs, probable internal bleeding, a severe concussion, and injuries to his spine that she couldn't fully assess in the field. But that explained his inability to move his legs. She administered morphine with a practiced hand, and as the drug began to dull the worst of the pain, Jake felt himself starting to drift. He fought against it, needing to see Ghost one more time, needing to acknowledge what had passed between them before the medicine pulled him under. The white stallion stood at the edge of the lantern light, his coat luminous in the darkness, his dark eyes fixed on the man who lay broken in the wagon bed. Jake tried to lift his hand, managed to raise it a few inches in what might have been a wave or a salute or simply a gesture of gratitude so profound that language failed entirely. Ghost tossed his head, a movement that sent his white mane flying, and then he wheeled and disappeared into the darkness, his hoofbeats fading quickly as he galloped away toward whatever freedom awaited him. In the wild places beyond human reach, Tommy stood staring after him, and Jake heard the young man say softly that he'd never forget what he'd witnessed tonight, that he'd tell this story until the day he died, and probably no one would believe him. Charlie's response was characteristically gruff, observing that belief didn't matter much when the truth was standing right in front of you, and that sometimes the world revealed wonders that couldn't be explained away by logic or common sense. The journey back to Silver Creek took most of the night, the wagon moving as quickly as the rough terrain would allow, while Dr. Chen monitored Jake's vital signs with increasing concern. The morphine had provided temporary relief, but Jake could feel his body shutting down in increments, systems failing one by one as blood loss and shock took their toll. He drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation between the doctor and Charlie, medical terms he didn't fully understand but whose gravity he could sense in the tightness of their voices. Once, during a particularly rough stretch of road that sent fresh agony shooting through his damaged body, he surfaced long enough to hear Dr. Chen say quietly that they needed to prepare for the possibility that even if Jake survived the night, he might never walk again. The words should have devastated him, should have filled him with despair at the thought of life as a cripple in a world where a man's worth was measured by his physical capabilities, But all Jake could think about was Ghost, about the way the stallion had defied every natural instinct to stay with him, and he found himself believing that if such miracles were possible, then perhaps his body might find ways to heal that Dr. Chen's medical training couldn't predict. They reached Silver Creek just before dawn, the sky lightening to pewter gray in the east as the wagon pulled up in front of Dr. Chen's small clinic. The building had once been a general store, and she'd converted it into a combination living quarters and medical facility that served the scattered population of ranchers, miners, and townspeople who called this corner of Arizona territory home. She'd set up a proper operating room in what had been the storeroom, complete with equipment she'd had shipped from San Francisco at great expense, and it was there that they carried Jake on his makeshift stretcher. The pain of being moved had transcended anything the morphine could touch, and Jake heard himself making sounds that shamed him, animal cries that belonged to creatures being slaughtered rather than men being healed. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the red haze, calm and authoritative, telling him that pain meant he was still fighting, that his body wasn't ready to give up, and that she needed him to hold on just a little longer while she worked. The surgery lasted 7 hours, though Jake was mercifully unconscious for most of it. Dr. Chen later told him that she'd never worked on injuries so extensive, that his survival was due partly to her skill, but mostly to a constitution that refused to quit despite every medical reason it should have. She'd repaired the internal bleeding, set the broken ribs as best she could, and addressed the spinal injury that had caused his paralysis. But she'd been honest with him when he finally woke 3 days later, telling him that modern medicine had limits, that some damage went beyond the reach of surgical techniques and pharmaceutical interventions. His legs showed no response to stimulation, and while she held out hope that the swelling around his spinal cord might decrease with time, allowing some function to return, she couldn't make promises that might prove false. Jake had accepted this information with a calmness that surprised even him, perhaps because after facing death in that canyon and being saved by a miracle in the form of a white stallion, the loss of his legs seemed almost manageable by comparison. The first week of recovery was the hardest, pain and fever alternating in waves that left him weak as a newborn calf. Dr. Chen visited multiple times each day, changing dressings and checking for signs of infection that could prove fatal even after surviving the initial injuries. She'd enlisted the help of Mrs. Morrison, a widow who supplemented her late husband's meager pension by serving as the town's unofficial nurse, and between the two women, Jake received care that went well beyond what most frontier patients could expect. They kept him clean and comfortable, administered medications on a strict schedule, and prevented the bed sores that plagued immobile patients. But it was Tommy Rodriguez who provided something equally important to Jake's recovery, bringing news from the world beyond the clinic walls and keeping Jake connected to the life he'd temporarily left behind. Tommy visited every afternoon without fail, settling into the chair beside Jake's bed and talking about everything and nothing, ranch gossip and horse training and the progress of the season's work. But what he talked about most was Ghost. The white stallion had become something of a celebrity in Silver Creek and the surrounding ranches, with Tommy's account of the rescue spreading quickly through the community. At first, Jake had worried that the attention might lead to renewed efforts to capture the Mustang, to turn him into a show horse or break him for some wealthy buyer who wanted to own something wild and beautiful. But Tommy assured him that quite the opposite had happened. The ranchers and cowboys who heard the story, men who normally viewed wild horses as little more than property waiting to be claimed, had begun to speak of Ghost with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. Old man Richardson had declared that no one from the Double R would ever attempt to capture the white stallion, and other ranch owners had followed suit, creating an informal protection that gave Ghost a kind of sanctuary status in the territory. The story had grown in the telling, as stories always did, and Jake heard versions that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. Some claimed Ghost had carried Jake out of the canyon on his back, that the stallion had fought off a pack of wolves to protect the injured man, that he'd stayed for days rather than hours. Jake didn't bother correcting these embellishments, understanding that the truth was extraordinary enough without requiring exaggeration, but also recognizing that stories served purposes beyond mere accuracy. Ghost had become a symbol of something larger than himself, representing the wildness that still existed in a territory increasingly tamed by railroads and barbed wire, and the steady march of civilization. People needed to believe in such things, needed to know that there were still mysteries in the world that couldn't be reduced to dollars and cents or locked behind fence posts. As Jake's physical condition slowly stabilized, he found himself thinking constantly about what came next. Horsebreaking had been more than his profession. It had been his identity, the thing that gave his life meaning and purpose. Without the use of his legs, that career was finished, and at 31 years old, he faced the daunting prospect of reinventing himself completely. He had some savings, enough to live on for a few months if he was careful, but beyond that, the future was a blank canvas that both excited and terrified him. Dr. Chen suggested he might consider teaching others his techniques, that his knowledge and experience were valuable, even if his body could no longer demonstrate them physically. Tommy had a different idea, proposing that Jake partner with him in starting a horse training operation that would emphasize the gentling methods Jake had perfected, creating a business model built on respect rather than breaking. Both suggestions had merit, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his path forward was somehow connected to Ghost, that the white stallion had saved him for a reason that went beyond mere survival. 6 weeks after the accident, Jake finally convinced Dr. Chen to let him sit outside in the afternoon sunshine, bundled in blankets despite the warmth of the October day. She'd relented only after extracting promises that he wouldn't overexert himself and would return inside at the first sign of fatigue. Tommy had fashioned a wheeled chair from an old office chair and some wagon wheels, rough but functional, and Jake had spent the morning learning to maneuver it through the clinic's narrow doorways. The freedom of movement, limited though it was, felt revolutionary after weeks of being confined to bed, and Jake savored the sensation of sun on his face and wind in his hair as he sat on the porch watching the town go about its business. Silver Creek was small by any standard, barely 300 souls counting the outlying ranches, but it had a vitality that came from being on the edge of wilderness, a place where anything seemed possible if you were willing to work for it. He was watching a freight wagon lumber down the main street, its wheels churning up dust that hung golden in the afternoon light, when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the west. Jake's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, some instinct alerting him before his conscious mind understood why. The rider who emerged from the shimmering heat haze at the edge of town sat tall in the saddle, and Jake's breath caught as he recognized the horse beneath him. Not Ghost himself, but a mare from the White Stallion's band, distinctive for the dark stockings on her front legs. The rider was a woman, which was unusual enough in itself, but what made Jake's heart skip was the way she rode, with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up on horseback and had never learned to fear the power of the animal beneath her. She dismounted in front of the clinic with fluid grace, looping the mare's reins over the hitching post with practiced efficiency. Up close, Jake could see she was perhaps 25 years old, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors and dark hair braided in the traditional style of the Apache people. Her clothing was a mixture of cultures, a split riding skirt that allowed for horseback travel, but with beadwork that marked her as someone who honored the old ways even while adapting to the new. She looked at Jake with eyes that were dark and direct, assessing him with an intensity that made him feel exposed in a way he hadn't experienced since waking in Dr. Chen's clinic. There was no pity in that gaze, only a keen evaluation that seemed to see past his injuries to something essential beneath. She spoke first, her voice carrying an accent that suggested English was not her first language, but one she'd mastered well enough. "You are the one they call Jake Mercer, the man who gentles horses without breaking their spirits." It was a statement rather than a question, and Jake found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to respond. "I am," he said, then added, "though I'm not doing much gentling these days." He gestured toward his useless legs, trying to keep his voice light despite the bitterness that still caught in his throat sometimes when he thought about all he'd lost. She glanced at his legs with the same matter-of-fact assessment she'd given his face, then looked back up with an expression that suggested his disability was noted, but not particularly relevant to whatever had brought her here. "My name is Delilah Tso. I am of the ND people, though I was raised in the mission school at Fort Apache after my parents died. I have come because of the White Stallion." The mention of Ghost sent a jolt through Jake's system, something between anticipation and protectiveness. In the weeks since his rescue, he'd thought constantly about the magnificent animal that had saved his life, wondering where Ghost roamed now, whether he was safe from those who might not respect the informal protection the local ranchers had granted him. "What about him?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the sudden tension he felt. Delilah moved closer, her movements economical and purposeful. "I need to tell you something about that horse, something that might be hard for you to believe. But first I need to know if you are someone who can accept truths that don't fit the world as white men understand it." The phrasing was unusual, but Jake understood what she was asking. He'd spent enough time around the territory's native peoples to know that they viewed the natural world through a lens that was fundamentally different from the European perspective that dominated frontier culture. Where most white settlers saw animals as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed, many of the indigenous tribes saw them as relations, beings with their own wisdom and purpose, who existed in a web of reciprocal obligations with humans and the land itself. "I saw a wild Mustang stay with a dying man for hours when every instinct should have driven him away," Jake said quietly. "I saw him call for help, like he understood what rescuers were and how to summon them. I saw him guide a search party directly to where I lay broken at the bottom of a canyon. If you're going to tell me something strange about Ghost, I'm probably more prepared to believe it than most." Delilah's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her careful composure. "Good. That will make this easier." She settled onto the porch railing, her posture relaxed despite the weight of whatever information she carried. "The White Stallion you call Ghost. We have known of him for 3 generations. My grandmother told stories of her grandmother seeing him in the canyons, looking exactly as he does now, always alone, always watching, always appearing when something significant was about to happen. Some of our people believe he is a spirit guide, a manifestation of the desert itself in the form of a horse. Others think he is simply very old, blessed with unusual longevity. But all agree that he is not like other horses, that he exists between the wild world and the human world, belonging fully to neither." Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. 3 generations would make Ghost impossibly old, well over a century if the stories were accurate. Horses didn't live that long, couldn't survive that long in the harsh conditions of the high desert. But he also knew that dismissing Delilah's words as superstition or legend would be both arrogant and foolish. He'd experienced firsthand that Ghost was extraordinary, that his behavior defied conventional understanding of wild horse psychology and instinct. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "What does it have to do with me?" Delilah leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "Because Ghost chose you. In all the stories my grandmother told, in all the sightings recorded by our people over the decades, there has never been a case of him staying with someone the way he stayed with you. He has appeared to warn of danger, to guide lost travelers to water, to mark the graves of those who died honorably in the wilderness. But he has never remained with an injured person, never called for help, never acted as a guardian. You are the first." The weight of those words settled over Jake like a physical presence. He thought about that night in the canyon, about the moment when Ghost had first appeared and looked down at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. There had been recognition in that gaze, something that went beyond the natural wariness between wild animal and human. It had felt like being seen, truly seen, in a way that transcended species and language, and the normal boundaries that separated one form of consciousness from another. "What does it mean?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Delilah was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. "My grandmother would say that ghosts see something in you that is important to the balance between the wild places and the settled places, that he saved you because you have work to do that serves both worlds. She would say that your injury, terrible as it is, was necessary to bring you to this moment, to strip away the life you knew so that you could step into the life you were meant to live." Jake wanted to reject this interpretation, to dismiss it as mystical nonsense that had no bearing on the practical reality of his situation, but he found he couldn't. Something about Delilah's words resonated with feelings he'd been having since waking in Dr. Chen's clinic. A sense that his fall in the canyon had been more than just an accident, that it had opened a door to possibilities he couldn't yet see clearly. "You said you came here because of Ghost," he said, redirecting the conversation toward something more concrete. "Is there something specific you need from me?" She nodded, her expression growing more serious. "There are men coming from back east, wealthy men who have heard the stories about the white stallion. They want to capture him, put him in their private zoos, or use him for breeding their fancy horses. They have money and connections, and they don't care about the informal protection the local ranchers have granted him. Old Man Richardson got word yesterday that they'll be arriving within the week with professional horse hunters and equipment designed specifically for capturing wild mustangs." The news hit Jake like a physical blow. The thought of Ghost trapped, confined, reduced from a symbol of freedom to a curiosity in some rich man's collection was obscene. He'd spent his life working with horses, and while he'd never been opposed to domestication per se, he understood that some animals were meant to remain wild, that their value lay precisely in their refusal to be owned or controlled. Ghost was such an animal, perhaps the ultimate example of wildness that needed to exist for its own sake, rather than for human purposes. "We have to stop them," Jake said, the words emerging with more force than he'd intended. "We have to protect him." Delilah smiled for the first time, and it transformed her serious features into something radiant. "Yes, that is why I came to you. Because you understand, and because Ghost chose you. If anyone can find a way to keep him free, it will be the man he saved." The challenge was enormous, made even more daunting by Jake's physical limitations. He couldn't ride, couldn't track through rough terrain, couldn't do any of the things that would normally be required to outsmart professional horse hunters. But as he sat there on the clinic porch with Delilah watching him with those dark, expectant eyes, Jake felt something stir inside him that he'd thought was dead, buried alongside his old life at the bottom of Copper Canyon. It was purpose, pure and clear and undeniable, calling him to action despite the wheelchair and the pain and the uncertain future. Ghost had saved his life for a reason, and now Jake understood what that reason was. He was meant to return the favor, to use everything he knew about horses and men and the wild places where they intersected to ensure that the magnificent white stallion remained free to roam the canyonlands forever. Planning began that very afternoon in Dr. Chen's small parlor, with Delilah, Tommy, and Charlie Brennan gathered around Jake's wheelchair like generals plotting a military campaign. Dr. Chen had initially objected to Jake involving himself in anything more strenuous than reading and gentle exercise, but one look at his face had told her that arguing would be pointless. Instead, she'd set conditions, regular rest periods and medication schedules that couldn't be compromised, and had positioned herself nearby with her medical bag, ready to intervene if Jake showed signs of overtaxing his still healing body. The map they spread across the low table was one Jake had drawn himself years ago, a detailed rendering of the canyon systems where Ghost and his band typically roamed, marked with water sources and sheltered grazing areas, and the narrow passes that served as the only routes in and out of the most remote sections. Charlie studied the map with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 40 years reading terrain, his thick fingers tracing potential approach routes that professional hunters might use. "They'll come from the north," he said, tapping a section where the canyons opened onto relatively flat grassland. "It's the only direction where they can bring wagons, and the kind of equipment Delilah described, those rope traps and portable corrals they use, need space to set up, and most of the canyon entrances are too narrow." Tommy leaned closer, his young face intent with concentration. "But if they come from the north, they'll funnel Ghost and his band deeper into the canyon system. They could trap them against the big drop-off at Red Rock Point, the place where the canyon walls rise straight up for 500 feet with no way around." It was a sound analysis, and Jake felt a surge of pride in how much the kid had learned just from watching and listening over the years. Delilah added her own knowledge to the discussion, information passed down through generations of her people who had used these canyons long before white settlers arrived. She knew about passages that didn't appear on any map, narrow slots between rock faces that a horse could navigate, but that would be invisible to outsiders unfamiliar with the terrain. She knew which water sources were permanent and which dried up in late fall, knowledge that would be crucial for predicting where Ghost's band would be at any given time. Most importantly, she knew about the sacred places, the areas that her people avoided out of respect for the spirits that dwelt there. And she believed that Ghost himself might seek refuge in those protected spaces, if pressed hard enough by pursuers who didn't know to fear what they couldn't see. The plan that emerged from their discussion was both simple and audacious. They couldn't prevent the hunters from entering the canyon system, that much was clear. But they could make the hunt so difficult, so frustrating, and so ultimately futile that the wealthy men financing it would give up and return east with nothing to show for their investment but wasted time and wounded pride. The strategy had three main components. First, they would position observers at key points throughout the canyons, people who could track both Ghost's movements and the hunter's progress, relaying information back to Jake, who would coordinate the overall effort from Silver Creek. Tommy volunteered immediately, and Charlie agreed despite his arthritis and age, saying he could still sit a horse for long hours, even if his roping days were behind him. Delilah would serve as their primary scout, using her knowledge of the hidden passages to move through the canyon system without being detected. She could also potentially communicate with other members of her tribe who lived in the area, creating a network of watchers that the hunters would never suspect existed. Second, they would engage in what Charlie colorfully described as guerrilla tactics, small actions designed to slow the hunters down and make their work more difficult without directly confronting them or doing anything that could be prosecuted as sabotage. They would move water troughs and salt licks that the hunters might use to bait Ghost into traps. They would create false trail signs that led nowhere. They would make noise at strategic times to spook the wild horses away from areas where capture attempts were being prepared. It was the kind of campaign that required intimate knowledge of both horse behavior and human psychology, and Jake found himself energized by the intellectual challenge despite his physical limitations. The third component was the most ambitious and the most uncertain. If they could guide Ghost and his band into one of the truly remote sections of the canyon system, the places where even experienced trackers rarely ventured, they might be able to keep the horses hidden until the hunters gave up entirely. But this required somehow communicating with Ghost, making him understand that he needed to move in a specific direction rather than following his natural instincts. It was here that Delilah's beliefs about the white stallion's supernatural nature became practically relevant. She insisted that Ghost would understand what they were trying to do, that his intelligence went beyond normal equine cognition into something that bordered on prescience. Jake wasn't sure he believed in the spiritual aspects of her claims, But he'd seen enough of Ghost's behavior to know that the stallion was extraordinary by any measure. If any horse could grasp what they needed from him, it would be Ghost. As they refined the details of their plan, word of their efforts spread through Silver Creek with the speed that information always traveled in small towns. By evening, a steady stream of visitors had made their way to Dr. Chen's clinic. Ranchers and cowboys and townspeople who wanted to volunteer their help in protecting the white stallion, Old Man Richardson, arrived with an offer to provide supplies and horses for the scouts, refusing to accept payment and declaring that protecting Ghost was more important than any business consideration. Mrs. Morrison brought food enough for a week, saying that men planning campaigns needed proper nutrition. Even the saloon keeper, a notoriously hard-nosed businessman named Frank Delaney, showed up with a cash donation and stories about how he'd seen Ghost once years ago, an encounter that had stayed with him ever since. The outpouring of support was overwhelming and humbling, a reminder that Ghost had captured the imagination of the entire community, becoming something more than just a wild horse, a symbol of the freedom and wildness that drew people to the frontier in the first place. But not everyone was supportive of their plans. That night, as Jake lay in his bed at the clinic, trying to rest despite the excitement churning through his mind, he heard raised voices from the front room. Dr. Chen was arguing with someone, her normally calm voice sharp with anger. Jake maneuvered his wheelchair to the doorway and saw her facing down Marshal William Cartwright, a federal officer who'd been appointed to maintain law and order across 3 territorial districts. Cartwright was a political animal rather than a true lawman, more interested in cultivating relationships with wealthy and powerful people than in serving the needs of common settlers. His presence at the clinic at this hour suggested that word of their plans had reached ears they hadn't intended. The marshal's voice carried clearly through the thin walls as he warned Dr. Chen that interfering with legitimate business activities, even activities as distasteful as capturing wild horses, could have legal consequences. The wealthy men coming to hunt Ghost had connections in Washington, he said, connections that could make life very difficult for anyone who opposed their interests. Jake wheeled himself into the front room, interrupting the marshal's lecture. "These wealthy men you're so worried about," he said, his voice carrying an edge he hadn't known he possessed. "Do they have legal claim to Ghost? Have they purchased land in the canyon systems where he runs? Or are they just assuming they can take whatever they want because they have money and influence?" Cartwright's face flushed with irritation at being challenged. "The law is clear about wild horses, Mercer. They're unclaimed property, available to whoever can capture them. Your accident doesn't give you special rights over that animal, touching story though it may be." The dismissive tone ignited something hot and fierce in Jake's chest. "That animal saved my life. He stayed with me when he should have run. He called for help when every instinct should have driven him away. I don't care about your laws or your wealthy friends or your political ambitions. Ghost stays free, and if that means I end up in your jail, then so be it." The confrontation might have escalated further if Dr. Chen hadn't stepped between them, her small frame radiating authority despite being dwarfed by both men. "Marshal Cartwright, Mr. Mercer is my patient and is supposed to be resting. Whatever business you have can wait until tomorrow when his health won't be compromised by stress and agitation. Now please leave my clinic." Cartwright left, but not before promising that this conversation wasn't over, that there would be consequences for anyone who interfered with the hunt. After he was gone, Jake sat in his wheelchair feeling the adrenaline drain away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Dr. Chen knelt beside him, her hand on his arm, gentle despite her earlier fierceness. "You need to be careful," she said quietly. "Cartwright is small-minded and vindictive. He'll look for any excuse to make trouble for you." Jake nodded, understanding the warning but unable to regret his words. Ghost had given him back his life in that canyon, had shown him that miracles were possible and that some bonds transcended the normal boundaries of existence. He would protect that gift with everything he had left, regardless of the cost. The hunters arrived on a cold morning in early November, their wagons rolling into Silver Creek with a precision that spoke of military organization rather than casual frontier travel. Jake watched from the clinic porch as they established their camp on the outskirts of town, counting at least a dozen men plus their leader, a man named Thornton who wore expensive Eastern clothing and carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. The equipment they unloaded was impressive and disturbing in equal measure: sophisticated rope systems and portable corrals made from steel rather than wood, tranquilizer rifles that were cutting-edge technology for capturing dangerous animals, and provisions enough to sustain a lengthy campaign. These men weren't amateurs hoping to get lucky. They were professionals who'd obviously captured wild horses before and knew exactly what they were doing. Tommy rode out to the camp that afternoon under the pretense of selling fresh vegetables from his family's garden, a cover story that allowed him to observe their preparations up close. He returned with detailed intelligence that confirmed Jake's worst fears. Thornton had brought maps and photographs, evidence that he'd been researching Ghost for months before coming west. He knew about the Stallion's preferred grazing areas, his typical movement patterns, even the approximate size of his band. Someone had been feeding him information, probably one of the ranch hands who'd seen Ghost over the years and didn't share the community's protective attitude. Worse, Thornton had permits from the territorial government authorizing him to capture wild horses for commercial purposes, documents that Marshal Cartwright would undoubtedly use to justify any interference with their protection efforts. The legal framework was stacked against them, and Jake knew they would have to be extremely careful to avoid crossing lines that could result in arrests or worse. Delilah left before dawn the next morning, riding her mare into the canyon systems to locate Ghost and warn him, if such a thing was possible, that danger was coming. Jake had given her a carefully crafted plan, suggesting routes the stallion could take that would lead him into the most remote sections of the canyons, where capture would be nearly impossible. She'd listened intently, then looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes and said that she would speak to Ghost in the language of her people, in words that carried meaning beyond mere sound. Jake didn't fully understand what she meant, but he trusted her connection to the old ways, to the spiritual dimension of the natural world that his own culture had largely forgotten. As he watched her disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, he felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. He was coordinating this effort, making decisions that would determine whether Ghost remained free or ended his days as a captive curiosity, and the magnitude of that trust was almost overwhelming. The first actual confrontation came 3 days later when Thornton's men located Ghost's band grazing in a meadow near Cedar Springs. Charlie had been watching from a ridge above and sent word back to Jake through a relay of riders, describing how the hunters had attempted to approach using the prevailing wind to mask their scent. But someone, Charlie couldn't say who or what, had spooked the horses before the trap could be sprung. The wild band had scattered in multiple directions, with Ghost leading a group of mares north toward the more rugged terrain, while the younger horses fled south toward different canyon systems. Thornton had been furious, Charlie reported, convinced that someone had deliberately warned the horses, though he had no proof and no idea who might have done it. Jake allowed himself a small smile at this news, suspecting that Delilah had been nearby, using her knowledge of the land to stay invisible while ensuring Ghost wasn't caught unprepared. Over the following week, a pattern emerged that frustrated Thornton's hunters at every turn. They would locate Ghost's band, set up their equipment, prepare their capture attempt, and then something would go wrong. A sudden noise would spook the horses at a critical moment. The portable corrals would be found damaged or displaced. Water sources that should have drawn the thirsty animals instead showed signs of contamination that made them undrinkable. The hunters suspected sabotage but could never catch anyone in the act, and Marshal Cartwright's investigations turned up nothing despite his eagerness to find evidence against Jake's network of protectors. The community of Silver Creek and the surrounding ranches maintained a careful silence. no one admitting to any involvement while everyone quietly supported the effort to keep Ghost free. It was frontier solidarity at its finest. People who might disagree on politics or religion or business practices coming together around a shared value that transcended their differences. Jake coordinated everything from his wheelchair, becoming the still center around which the protection effort revolved. Riders came and went from the clinic at all hours, bringing news and receiving instructions, creating a command post that operated with surprising efficiency despite its informal structure. Dr. Chen had initially worried about the stress on Jake's recovery, but had come to recognize that this purpose was actually helping him heal, giving him a reason to push through pain and fatigue that mere physical therapy never could have provided. He was sleeping better, eating more, and showing signs of recovery that went beyond what her medical training had predicted. There was even some sensation returning to his legs, faint tingling that she cautioned might be temporary, but that Jake chose to interpret as proof that miracles could continue happening if you believed in them strongly enough. But Thornton was not a man who gave up easily, and as his frustration mounted, his methods became more aggressive. He began offering rewards for information about who was sabotaging his efforts, substantial sums of money that tempted some of the poorer residents who'd been struggling through a difficult year. He complained loudly to Marshal Cartwright about the lack of cooperation from local law enforcement, threatening to go over the marshal's head to territorial authorities in Phoenix who might take a different view of the situation. Most concerning, he started talking about expanding his operation, bringing in more men and equipment, turning the hunt into a campaign that could potentially last months or even years if necessary. The stakes were rising, and Jake knew they couldn't maintain their defensive strategy indefinitely. Sooner or later, Thornton would get lucky or find a weak point in their protection network, and Ghost would be captured unless they could find a way to end the threat permanently. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Morrison appeared at the clinic one evening with information she'd overheard at the general store, where Thornton's men sometimes purchased supplies. They were planning a major operation in 3 days' time, bringing all their resources to bear on a section of canyon where they'd gotten reports of Ghost's band congregating near a reliable water source. It would be their most ambitious attempt yet, with men positioned at every possible escape route and equipment set up to capture not just Ghost but his entire band. If they succeeded, they would have leverage. Thornton apparently believed that Ghost would surrender rather than watch his mares be taken. It was a sound strategy that played on the Stallion's protective instincts, and Jake recognized immediately that this was the crisis moment they'd been dreading. Everything they'd done to protect Ghost would mean nothing if Thornton's big operation succeeded. Jake called an emergency meeting that same night, gathering everyone who'd been involved in the protection effort. The clinic's small parlor was packed with people standing shoulder to shoulder, and the air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. He laid out what they knew about Thornton's plans, watching faces grow grim as they understood the implications. Charlie suggested they try to move Ghost's band before the operation could be launched, but Delilah shook her head, explaining that forcing the horses to relocate now would only make them more vulnerable, disrupting their patterns and leaving them disoriented. Tommy proposed a direct confrontation, physically blocking the hunters from entering that section of canyon. But Jake knew that would play right into Thornton's hands, giving him exactly the kind of illegal interference he needed to bring in territorial authorities and possibly even federal troops. What they needed was a way to make Ghost disappear so completely that Thornton would have no choice but to admit defeat and leave. And as Jake studied the map spread across his lap, tracing the network of canyons and passages that he'd explored over years of working in this country, an idea began to form that was audacious enough to work. The plan Jake proposed was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. There was a section of the canyon system that appeared on no official maps, a series of connected chambers and passages that Jake had discovered years ago while tracking a lost mare. The entrance was hidden behind a rock fall that looked impassable, but actually concealed a narrow opening large enough for horses to squeeze through single file. Inside, The passages opened into a natural amphitheater with grass and a spring-fed pool, a perfect sanctuary that could sustain Ghost's band indefinitely. The problem was getting the horses there without Thornton's men following, and doing it in the 2 days remaining before the big capture operation launched. It would require perfect timing, complete coordination, and a level of trust between humans and wild horses that most people would consider impossible. But Jake had spent his life building exactly that kind of trust, and he believed that Ghost would understand what they were trying to do. Delilah volunteered immediately to guide Ghost and his band to the hidden sanctuary, saying that she could communicate the urgency through methods her grandmother had taught her, songs and movements that spoke to horses in ways that transcended normal training. Tommy would accompany her, providing backup and ensuring they weren't followed by any of Thornton's scouts who might be ranging through the canyons. Charlie would create a diversion, taking a group of ranchers on a loud, obvious trail ride through a different section of canyon to draw attention away from Ghost's actual movement. The remaining volunteers would position themselves along the route, ready to block or delay any hunters who somehow managed to detect the relocation. It was a plan that required everything to go right, with no margin for error and no backup if something went wrong. Dr. Chen looked at Jake with concern written clearly across her features, knowing that he wanted to be out there with them, that sitting in his wheelchair coordinating from town was torture for someone who'd spent his life active in the field. But she also knew, as they all did, that Jake's role was crucial precisely because he could see the entire operation from a strategic perspective rather than getting lost in tactical details. The operation began before dawn on the day before Thornton's planned big push. Delilah and Tommy rode out under cover of darkness, their horses moving silently through terrain they'd memorized over weeks of scouting. Jake sat in the clinic parlor with his maps spread around him, tracking their progress in his mind based on the timeline they'd established. Each phase of the operation marked by riders who would report back at designated intervals. The first message came at sunrise, delivered by one of the Richardson ranch hands who'd been watching from a high vantage point. Delilah had made contact with Ghost's band, and the stallion had approached her mare with what the observer described as unusual boldness, almost as if he'd been expecting her arrival. The white stallion had circled Delilah 3 times, his movements deliberate and ritualistic, and then he'd begun moving his band north toward the hidden sanctuary, following the route Jake had specified without any apparent hesitation or confusion. The news sent a surge of hope through Jake that was almost painful in its intensity. Ghost understood. Somehow, the magnificent stallion grasped what they were trying to do and was cooperating in his own rescue. It shouldn't have been possible, defied everything Jake knew about equine cognition and behavior, but he'd long since given up trying to fit Ghost into conventional categories. The white stallion existed in a space between the explicable and the mysterious, and Jake was grateful for that mystery, even as it challenged his understanding of the natural world. The second report came 2 hours later, confirming that Ghost's band had passed the first checkpoint without incident and was making good time toward the hidden entrance. Charlie's diversion was working perfectly, with Thornton's scouts following the loud group of ranchers away from Ghost's actual location, drawn by the obvious trail signs and the sound of multiple horses moving through the canyons. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and Jake allowed himself to believe that they might actually pull this off. Then the third rider arrived with news that sent ice through Jake's veins. Marshal Cartwright had apparently gotten wind of unusual activity in the canyons and had ridden out with 2 deputies to investigate. They'd encountered Delilah and Tommy near the halfway point, and while they hadn't directly interfered yet, their presence was causing Ghost's band to grow skittish and difficult to control. The stallion was becoming agitated, torn between his instinct to protect his mares and his apparent trust in Delilah's guidance. If the situation deteriorated, the entire operation could collapse, with Ghost potentially bolting in an unpredictable direction that would lead him straight into Thornton's trap. Jake made a decision in that moment that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He told Mrs. Morrison to bring his horse, a gentle gelding that he'd owned for years, but hadn't been near since his accident, and to help him into the saddle regardless of Dr. Chen's medical objections. The doctor started to protest, reminding him of his injuries and the very real risk of falling and undoing months of healing. But something in Jake's expression stopped her. She recognized the look of a man who'd found his purpose and would not be deterred regardless of the cost. Getting Jake onto the horse was an ordeal that left him sweating and shaking with pain, his useless legs having to be positioned manually and secured with rope to keep him in the saddle. It was undignified and uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, but once he was up, once he felt the familiar warmth of the horse beneath him and the reins in his hands, something shifted inside him. He wasn't whole, might never be whole again in the way he'd been before the accident, but he was functional enough for what needed to be done. Tommy's younger brother rode alongside him as they headed toward the canyons, ready to steady Jake if he started to slip and to help him dismount when they reached their destination. The journey took 45 minutes of careful navigation, Jake's body screaming protest with every jolt and movement, but his mind was clear and focused on what needed to happen next. They found Marshal Cartwright and his deputies at a narrow section of canyon, blocking the path that Ghost's band needed to take to reach the hidden sanctuary. The marshal's face showed surprise and then satisfaction when he saw Jake, clearly believing he'd caught the mastermind of the protection operation in an actionable offense. "Well now, Mercer," Cartwright said, his voice carrying false joviality that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny seeing you out here when you're supposedly crippled and confined to a wheelchair. Makes a man wonder what other lies you've been telling." Jake ignored the provocation, focusing instead on the situation developing behind the marshal. Ghost's band was visible about 100 yards away, the white stallion standing at the front with his head high and ears forward, assessing the humans who blocked his path. Delilah sat motionless on her mare, her posture radiating tension, as she tried to keep the wild horses calm while the standoff played out. Jake addressed the marshal with a calmness he didn't feel, explaining that he was simply out for a therapeutic ride, as recommended by Dr. Chen, that his presence here was purely coincidental. Cartwright wasn't buying it, but before he could respond, something extraordinary happened. Ghost began walking forward, moving past Delilah's position and approaching the group of mounted humans with deliberate purpose. The deputies' horses shifted nervously, sensing the power and wildness of the approaching stallion, but Ghost's attention was fixed entirely on Jake. The white horse stopped 10 feet away, close enough that Jake could see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes, and for a long moment they regarded each other in silence. Jake felt the weight of everything that had passed between them in that canyon where he'd nearly died, the debt that bound them together, the recognition that transcended species and language. Then Ghost did something that would be talked about in Silver Creek for generations to come. He lowered his head in a gesture that looked unmistakably like a bow, acknowledging Jake's presence and perhaps his effort to protect the band. Marshal Cartwright's mouth fell open, his prepared accusations dying on his lips as he witnessed something that defied his understanding of how wild animals behaved. Even his deputies seemed transfixed, their hands frozen on their reins as they watched the white stallion's deliberate display. Ghost held the bow for several seconds, then raised his head and wheeled around, returning to his band with a fluid grace that made Jake's heart ache with its beauty. The entire group of wild horses moved forward then, passing within feet of the stunned lawman, following their leader with complete trust as Delilah guided them toward the hidden sanctuary. Cartwright made no move to stop them, and Jake knew why. What they'd just witnessed wasn't sabotage or illegal interference. It was something outside the marshal's experience entirely, something that belonged to the realm of stories and legends rather than law enforcement reports. How could he explain in an official document that a wild stallion had bowed to a crippled horse trainer, or that his deputies had been so mesmerized they'd forgotten to enforce the permits they were carrying? By the time Ghost's band disappeared behind the rockfall that concealed the entrance to the hidden sanctuary, the marshal and his deputies had recovered enough to remember their official duties. But the moment had passed. Cartwright looked at Jake with an expression that mixed frustration and something that might have been grudging respect, clearly understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered not through illegal means, but through a connection between man and horse that existed outside the framework of territorial law. He warned Jake that this wasn't over, that Thornton would be furious when his big operation found nothing, and that there would be consequences for everyone involved in the protection effort. But his words lacked conviction, and Jake suspected that the marshal himself was beginning to question whether Ghost should be captured, whether some things were meant to remain wild, regardless of what wealthy men desired or what permits authorized. The ride back to Silver Creek was agony for Jake, every movement sending fresh pain radiating through his damaged body, but he endured it with a sense of accomplishment that made the suffering worthwhile. They'd done it, saved Ghost from capture, and given the magnificent Stallion a refuge where he could live out his days free from human interference. Dr. Chen was waiting at the clinic when they arrived, her face a mask of professional disapproval that couldn't quite hide her relief at seeing him return safely. She helped him from the saddle with Mrs. Morrison's assistance, scolding him the entire time for his recklessness and warning that he'd probably set his recovery back by weeks. But as she examined him later, checking for new injuries or damage to his healing spine, she admitted quietly that the risk might have been necessary, that some things mattered more than medical caution or physical safety. Thornton's big operation the next day was a spectacular failure. His men surrounded the area where they'd expected to find Ghost's band, deployed their sophisticated equipment with military precision, and closed their trap on absolutely nothing. The canyon was empty, the water source untouched, no sign that horses had been anywhere near the location in days. Thornton was beside himself with rage, convinced that someone had warned the horses or driven them away deliberately, but his hunters could find no evidence of recent human activity beyond their own. The white stallion had simply vanished along with his entire band, as if they'd never existed at all. Some of Thornton's men began talking about ghosts and spirits, drawing on the legends they'd heard in Silver Creek about the stallion's supernatural nature, and even Thornton himself seemed shaken by the complete absence of any trail or sign. He stormed into town that evening, demanding that Marshal Cartwright arrest everyone he suspected of involvement in sabotaging the hunt. But the marshal, to his credit, stood firm in a way Jake hadn't expected, pointing out that speculation and suspicion weren't evidence, and that he couldn't arrest people for the crime of wild horses being unpredictable. Thornton threatened to go over Cartwright's head, to bring in federal marshals or even military forces to find the missing horses. But the marshal simply shrugged and suggested that Thornton was free to try explaining to territorial authorities why he needed federal intervention to catch one wild Mustang. The confrontation ended with Thornton promising this wasn't over, that he would return with more resources and legal authority. But everyone who witnessed the exchange could see that his confidence was shaken, that the absolute certainty he'd arrived with had been replaced by doubt and frustration. Over the following week, Thornton's camp gradually broke up as men drifted away to other jobs and opportunities. The professional hunters he'd brought from back east were expensive to maintain, and without results to justify the investment, the financial pressure mounted. His wealthy backers began sending telegrams demanding explanations, and Thornton found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to admit failure to people who were unaccustomed to hearing that word. By the end of November, he'd packed up his remaining equipment and left Silver Creek, though not before stopping at the clinic to speak with Jake one final time. The conversation was surprisingly civil. Two men who respected each other's capabilities, even while remaining on opposite sides of an ideological divide. Thornton admitted that he'd underestimated both the difficulty of capturing Ghost and the determination of the local community to protect him. Jake, for his part, acknowledged that Thornton had been a formidable adversary, that his failure was due more to Ghost's extraordinary nature than to any shortcoming in Thornton's methods. As winter settled over the Arizona territory, bringing cold nights and occasional snow to the high desert, Jake found himself entering a new phase of life that bore little resemblance to what had come before. His legs had begun responding more consistently to stimulation, enough that Dr. Chen believed he might eventually regain some walking ability with the help of crutches or leg braces. It would never be the full mobility he'd enjoyed before the accident, but it was more than they'd dared hope for during those first desperate weeks of recovery. More importantly, he'd discovered a new purpose that didn't depend on his physical capabilities. Word of his success in protecting Ghost had spread through the territory, and people began seeking him out for advice on horse training and management, particularly ranchers who were interested in the gentling methods he'd perfected. He found he could teach effectively from his wheelchair, that his understanding of equine behavior was valuable regardless of whether he could personally demonstrate the techniques. Tommy became his apprentice officially, moving into a room above the livery stable so he could be near the clinic and learning everything Jake could teach him about working with horses. The young man had a natural gift that reminded Jake of himself at that age, an intuition about what horses needed and how to communicate with them that couldn't be taught but only recognized and refined. Together they began developing a training program that emphasized partnership over domination, respect over breaking, building on principles Jake had followed instinctively but had never articulated formally. It was rewarding work that gave Jake a sense of continuity, of passing on knowledge that might otherwise have died with him in that canyon, and he took pride in watching Tommy grow into a skilled horseman who understood that true mastery came from understanding rather than control. Delilah visited regularly through the winter, bringing news from the hidden sanctuary where Ghost and his band had settled into their new home. She discovered that the natural amphitheater was even more perfect than Jake had remembered, with enough grazing to support the entire band and the spring providing reliable water, even during the driest months. Ghost himself seemed content in his refuge, though Delilah reported that he would sometimes stand at the hidden entrance, as if listening for sounds from the outside world, as if remembering the man who'd protected his freedom at such personal cost. She also continued sharing stories from her grandmother's teachings, helping Jake understand that his connection with Ghost was part of a larger pattern, a web of relationships between humans and the natural world that his culture had largely forgotten but that could still be rediscovered by those willing to listen. Christmas came to Silver Creek with surprising warmth despite the cold weather, the community gathering for celebrations that felt more meaningful than usual. There was a sense among the townspeople that they'd accomplished something important by protecting Ghost, that they'd drawn a line against the kind of exploitation that treated wild creatures as commodities to be bought and sold. Jake found himself at the center of these celebrations whether he wanted to be or not, receiving thanks and recognition that made him uncomfortable but that he accepted as gracefully as he could. What mattered most to him wasn't the recognition, but the knowledge that Ghost was safe, that the magnificent white stallion would continue running free through the canyonlands for whatever years remained to him, untouched by the forces that sought to capture and control everything wild and beautiful in the world. Spring arrived in the Arizona territory with a suddenness that always surprised newcomers, but that longtime residents had learned to expect, the desert transforming overnight from brown dormancy to a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Jake had been working with leg braces for 3 months by then, learning to walk again with the kind of determination he'd once applied to gentling difficult horses. The process was slow and painful, each step requiring conscious effort and concentration, but he refused to accept that his wheelchair was a permanent limitation. Dr. Chen watched his progress with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal amazement, admitting that she'd never seen a patient work so hard at recovery or achieve results that seemed to defy her initial prognosis. But Jake knew his motivation was different from most patients. He wasn't just trying to walk again for its own sake. He was preparing for something specific. A journey he'd been planning since the first warm days of February had suggested that winter was loosening its grip. On a morning in late April, when the desert air was perfect and the sky was that particular shade of blue that existed nowhere else on Earth, Jake made his way to the livery stable where Tommy was preparing horses for the day's work. The young man looked up in surprise when he saw Jake standing without support, using only a carved walking stick that Charlie Brennan had made for him, his legs steady beneath him. Despite the visible effort it took to maintain his balance, Tommy's face broke into a grin that reflected the pride he felt in his mentor's recovery, but his expression grew serious when Jake explained what he wanted to do. He was going to the hidden sanctuary to see Ghost one final time, to close the circle that had opened on that terrible day in Copper Canyon when a white stallion had chosen to save a dying man for reasons that perhaps neither of them fully understood. The journey took most of the day, Jake riding his gentle gelding with Tommy alongside, moving slowly through terrain that Jake knew intimately despite the months he'd been away from it. Every canyon and rock formation held memories, markers of a life spent in pursuit of understanding the horses that made the frontier possible, and Jake found himself reflecting on how much had changed since his accident. He'd lost his old identity as the territory's best horsebreaker, lost the physical capabilities that had defined him for 31 years. But he'd gained something unexpected in return, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be connected to the wild places and wild creatures that still existed in pockets throughout the settled world. Ghost had taught him that some bonds transcended utility or training, that the relationship between humans and horses could be something sacred rather than merely practical if both parties approached it with the right spirit. They reached the rockfall that concealed the entrance to the hidden sanctuary in late afternoon. The sun still high enough to light their way, but beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. Jake dismounted carefully, his legs trembling with the effort of the long ride, and made his way to the narrow opening that led into the natural amphitheater. Tommy offered to come with him, but Jake shook his head, knowing that this final meeting needed to be private, something between him and the stallion who'd changed his life in ways he was still discovering. He squeezed through the opening, remembering the first time he'd found this place years ago while tracking that lost mare, marveling that such a perfect sanctuary could exist hidden in plain sight from everyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The amphitheater was more beautiful than he remembered, spring grass covering the floor in emerald abundance and wildflowers dotting the landscape with splashes of color. Ghost's band was grazing peacefully near the far end, the mares and younger horses moving in the relaxed patterns of animals who felt completely safe in their environment. And standing slightly apart from the others, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment, was Ghost himself. The white stallion's coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, and despite the months that had passed, he looked exactly as Jake remembered him, ageless and magnificent and impossibly real. They regarded each other across the distance, man and horse, saved and savior, connected by something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of their respective worlds. Jake walked forward slowly, his walking stick helping him navigate the uneven ground, and Ghost began moving toward him with that same deliberate purpose he'd shown the day he'd bowed before Marshal Cartwright. They met in the center of the amphitheater, close enough that Jake could reach out and touch the stallion's gleaming coat, feel the warmth and vitality of the creature who'd refused to let him die alone in that canyon. Ghost lowered his head and Jake rested his forehead against the horse's face, closing his eyes and breathing in the scent of wild things and freedom. Words felt inadequate for what passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of debt and gratitude and mutual respect that transcended language. Jake had saved Ghost from captivity, but Ghost had saved him from something worse, a life half-lived, trapped by limitations he'd imposed on himself long before his physical injuries had given him an excuse to stop trying. After several minutes, Ghost raised his head and stepped back, his dark eyes holding Jake's with an intensity that felt almost human in its depth. Then the stallion wheeled and trotted back to his band, resuming his position as their protector and leader, and Jake understood that this was goodbye, not in the sense of never seeing each other again, but in the sense of each returning to their proper place in the order of things. Ghost belonged to the wild places, to the hidden sanctuaries and canyon systems that humans could visit but never truly possess. Jake belonged to the world of teaching and learning, of passing on knowledge and building bridges between the civilized and the wild. Their paths had intersected in that canyon where death had been transformed into something miraculous, and that intersection had changed them both. But now it was time to move forward into whatever futures awaited them. Jake made his way back through the narrow opening, finding Tommy waiting patiently with the horses, and together they began the long ride back to Silver Creek. As they traveled, Jake found himself thinking about all the stories he'd heard over the years, legends of animals that saved humans or humans that saved animals, tales of connection between species that seemed too perfect to be true. He'd always appreciated those stories, but had maintained a certain skepticism about their literal accuracy, assuming they were embellished versions of more mundane events. Now he understood that some stories were true in ways that went deeper than mere factual accuracy, that they captured essential truths about the world and our place in it that couldn't be expressed through simple recitation of facts. By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold that painted the desert landscape in colors that seemed impossible. Jake could see lights beginning to appear in the town's windows, families gathering for evening meals, the normal rhythms of frontier life continuing as they always had. But he knew that something fundamental had shifted, at least for him, and probably for many of the people who'd participated in protecting Ghost. They'd all been reminded that the wild still existed, that not everything could or should be tamed and controlled, that sometimes the greatest act of love was letting go and allowing freedom to flourish, even when it meant accepting loss and distance. Dr. Chen was waiting on the clinic porch when they arrived, her face showing relief at seeing Jake return safely from his journey. She helped him dismount and examined his legs, checking for signs of damage or overexertion, but found only the normal fatigue of muscles pushed to their limits. Later, as Jake sat in his room looking out at the star-filled sky, he thought about Ghost running free in his hidden sanctuary, thought about Tommy learning the old ways of working with horses that emphasize partnership over domination, thought about all the people in Silver Creek and beyond who'd been touched by the story of a white stallion and a broken man who'd saved each other in ways that neither could have managed alone. The future stretched before him now, uncertain but full of possibilities he'd never imagined during those dark days when death had seemed so certain. He would continue healing, continue teaching, continue building a life that honored the gift Ghost had given him. And somewhere in the canyon lands, a magnificent white stallion would continue running free, a living symbol of wildness that no amount of money or power could ever truly capture. A reminder that some things were meant to remain beyond human reach, beautiful precisely because they could never be owned or controlled.